I saw you push her," Mrs. Morales screamed, her voice slicing through the humid summer air like a blade. My 78-year-old grandmother, Justice Eleanor Grayson, lay crumpled in the garden bed beneath her balcony, blood seeping from her temple into the soil she had spent a decade nurturing. Above her, Pamela Greaves, president of the Wellington Glen HOA, still clutched the wooden spindle she had yanked from a railing. Her mouth hung open in mock horror, her voice shaky with theatrical concern. "The railing just gave way," she lied, her expression trying to mimic panic. Yet the gleam of satisfaction still clung to her eyes. But Pamela had no idea who she had just shoved off that balcony. Because Eleanor Grayson wasn't just some frail old woman. She was a former Supreme Court justice, a titan of property law, and one of the fiercest offenders of due process this country has ever known. She had spent 30 years ensuring that people like Pamela Greaves, petty tyrants hiding behind rules and committees, face accountability. And now she'd be facing her. It had all started with a fence. A beautiful hand-carved cedar fence enclosing my grandmother's rose garden, custom-built decades ago when she bought the property. It stood as both a boundary and a testament to the care she poured into her home. But the moment Pamela saw it, she saw something else. "A violation," she declared, slapping a citation onto the front door with her perfectly manicured hand. "This monstrosity violates HOA standards." My grandmother remained calm, as always. She explained that her home predated the formation of the HOA by more than 20 years, and was legally exempt. She even produced the original filing signed and notarized, with her own name in the attorney's signature line. But Pamela's eyes narrowed. Her smile tightened into something more predatory than polite. "We'll see about that," she said, turning on her heel. That was the beginning, not of a neighborly dispute, but of a slow-burning, meticulously orchestrated campaign of harassment. Every day there was something new. Strangers snapping photos of the fence. Anonymous complaints about property values. Unmarked envelopes slid under the door late at night, threatening legal action. HOA meetings rescheduled so Grandma couldn't attend. Fines escalating without basis. But Justice Grayson didn't rattle easily. She had faced governors, lobbyists, and the wrath of power-hungry politicians. This was just another petty tyrant with a clipboard and a fragile ego. And yet, even she knew something darker was building. What began as a citation was morphing into something far more sinister. Something that would test not just her legal expertise, but her life. The next escalation came quietly, under the guise of routine. I came home one afternoon to find Pamela Greaves kneeling in my grandmother's garden, plastic gloves on, scooping soil into a small plastic bag. "Environmental compliance check," she chirped, holding up a flimsy-looking document she claimed authorized the inspection. My grandmother, ever composed, politely asked her to leave. Pamela did, but not before stomping through an entire row of rare heirloom roses. Flowers my grandmother had cultivated for over a decade, flattened beneath the heels of designer wedges. Her jaw clenched, but she didn't raise her voice. That wasn't her style. That night, as I brought her tea, I found her on the phone, quietly speaking to someone she trusted. Her former clerk, now a county detective. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Just, "I need you to keep a close eye on Wellington Glen. Something isn't right." A week later, Pamela called an emergency HOA meeting, scheduled precisely during my grandmother's monthly cardiology appointment. With her out of the room, they passed a unanimous resolution, $100 in daily fines until the fence was removed. We returned home to find the notice duct taped to the door. My grandmother didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled softly and muttered, "Procedural error." She opened her leather-bound legal notepad and began drafting. According to their own bylaws, she said, notices must be delivered with a minimum 14-day buffer. This will be easy to overturn. But Pamela wasn't playing by the rules anymore. The next day, a building inspector arrived, unannounced. He never checked the neighbors' yards. He never glanced at the community pool, which had 3 visible code violations. He went straight to my grandmother's property and spent 45 minutes circling it, scribbling notes. I overheard Pamela outside, whispering behind a row of hedges. "Just find something," she said. Anything we can use. The inspector left empty-handed. But that wasn't the end of it. That night, Grandma installed new security cameras, disguised as decorative finials on the fence posts and balcony corners. As she adjusted one near the front porch, I asked her if she was worried. "No," she said, tightening the bracket. "I'm preparing." She looked out across the street, where Pamela's house sat, lights off, but the curtain pulled slightly to the side. "Preparation," she said softly, "is the foundation of justice." And I knew in that moment, this wasn't just about roses or fences. It was about power, fear, and something far more dangerous than a fine. Because Pamela wasn't trying to enforce rules. She was trying to break the person who had written them. It started with shadows. At first, we thought they were tricks of the light. Passing cars, kids cutting through lawns at dusk. But then came the flashlight beams, sweeping silently across the side of the house long after midnight. Movement in the hedges. Unmarked vans idling at the corner. Engines ticking quietly. Then came Bob Greaves, Pamela's husband. I caught him early one morning with a camera, crouched beside our mailbox, snapping pictures of the balcony support beams. When I stepped outside, he stood up quickly and forced a smile. "Admiring the architecture," he said. The measuring tape sticking from his back pocket told another story. When Grandma asked him to leave, he did, after trailing his fingers along the cedar fence like he was tracing it for demolition. Later that week, a brick crashed through the front window. It happened just after dinner. We'd been sitting in the living room, Grandma sipping mint tea, reviewing the latest zoning ordinances, just for fun. The explosion of glass was so sudden, so violent, that for a moment I couldn't move. We rushed to the source. Shards of glass glittered across the floor like ice. The brick sat in the middle of the room, wrapped in paper. 6 words, scrawled in red marker. "Remove the fence. Or else." We called the police. They came, took statements, asked questions. Pamela, of course, played her role perfectly. "Such a shame," she said, shaking her head in mock concern. "Kids these days. No respect." But we weren't naive. We knew. Grandma began documenting everything. Every photo, every note, every whispered conversation overheard through the windows. She stored it all in a red leather folder, its edges worn from decades of use. Inside it, I saw the names of neighbors, statements, time-stamped images, even copies of HOA meeting minutes with entire paragraphs highlighted in yellow. I was concerned for her safety, I admitted one night, but she never wavered. "I've spent 30 years protecting the Constitution," she told me, voice calm but resolute. "One power-hungry HOA president doesn't scare me." Still, the pressure mounted. Pamela's supporters, who seemed to be growing bolder, began showing up at odd hours. They'd loiter across the street, sometimes walking by slowly with clipboards or cameras, other times pretending to be on a jog. Mrs. Morales, our closest neighbor, installed her own security camera facing our property. "Just in case," she said. Then came the water damage. After a week of heavy rain, my grandmother's basement flooded. The plumber found the cause almost immediately. Someone had deliberately redirected the neighborhood drainage toward her foundation. Pipes tampered with, earth reshaped. It was subtle but intentional. And wouldn't you know it, Pamela appeared that very afternoon. Standing by the mailbox, she smiled sweetly. "Old houses," she cooed. "So many problems. You really ought to consider selling before it becomes uninhabitable." Later, the plumber pulled me aside. "She asked me last week about structural vulnerabilities," he whispered. "Wanted to know where the weak spots were." I thought it was weird. Now I understand why. And that was the moment I stopped wondering if this was personal. It was a campaign, a methodical one, a hostile takeover disguised as community management. And Pamela Greaves was playing the long game. But what she didn't know was that Eleanor Grayson had played longer and played better. One evening, just after dinner, Grandma invited me into her study, a small room at the back of the house that smelled faintly of old paper and sandalwood. It was where she'd written dissents that shaped national precedent, where portraits of long-gone justices lined the wall above a tidy oak desk. She gestured to a pile of documents spread out like a courtroom exhibit. property records, HOA bylaws, tax assessments, recorded deed transfers. This isn't about the fence, she said quietly. Then she handed me a manila folder with a map inside. Half a dozen homes were circled, each recently sold, each formerly owned by elderly residents, all purchased by a development company registered to Pamela's brother. She tapped one name, Mrs. Halvorson. She sold her house after a mysterious fire. No one ever proved arson. But look at the timing. 3 weeks after she was cited by the HOA for a non-regulation awning. Every home told a similar story. Repeated HOA violations, mysterious accidents, anonymous threats, all leading to desperate sales at well below market value. And in each case, the buyer was the same, Glenrise Partners, LLC, a shell company that traced directly back to Pamela's family. Grandma had been quietly building a case, thread by thread, over the course of months. Her red leather folder had become a legal bombshell in waiting. But what stunned me most was how calm she was. I've faced down governors who thought they were untouchable, she said, flipping through handwritten notes from elderly homeowners who'd come forward. Pamela's made a critical mistake. I looked at her, puzzled. She assumed I was just a little old woman with a rose garden, Grandma said with a soft smile. But I wrote the opinion that defined the legal scope of HOA governance in this state. I am the reason bylaws can't override due process. She wasn't exaggerating. Before she retired, Justice Eleanor Grayson had authored some of the most cited rulings in modern property law, including Grayson v. Clearwood, a landmark case that held that homeowners associations must be held to the same constitutional standards as public entities when exerting control over private property. In other words, she literally wrote the rulebook Pamela thought she was weaponizing. "I've got one more move," Grandma said, tapping her temple. "But we need to let her make hers first." That night, I saw a movement through blinds. 2 figures with flashlights, one carrying what looked like a tool belt. They circled the perimeter of the house, careful not to speak, avoiding the camera's red glow. I reached for my phone, but Grandma touched my hand. "Not yet," she said, eyes hard. "Let the cameras record. Sometimes people have to write their own indictments." She sat back in her chair, hands folded calmly, as the security feed rolled silently behind her. The morning of the fall was warm and unusually still. Birds chirped somewhere above the jasmine, and the air smelled like rosemary and wet soil from last night's rain. Grandma had just finished trimming her hanging planters, something she still insisted on doing herself. Even at 78, constitutional law and gardening, she liked to say, both require patience and careful pruning. I had gone inside to answer a phone call. 10 minutes, maybe less, and then I heard it. First, Pamela's voice, sharp, shrill, commanding. Then a crash that made my blood freeze. I ran outside and found my grandmother, Justice Eleanor Grayson, lying motionless in the dirt below her balcony, her head resting beside the rose bushes, one arm twisted beneath her, blood seeping into the soil she'd spent years cultivating. Above her, on the second-floor balcony, stood Pamela Greaves, hand still on the rail, one spindle missing, completely torn from the structure. Her mouth hung open, her face contorted into a mask of faux panic. "She fell," she shrieked. The railing gave way. I tried to help her, but I saw the glint in her eyes. That same glint she wore the day she tore through Grandma's roses. That smirk she used to hide behind concern. 2 of her HOA allies, her so-called board, stood nearby, already nodding along like trained puppets. But not everyone bought it, because across the street, Mrs. Morales, our neighbor who had installed that second security camera weeks ago, stepped forward. Her voice shook, but her words didn't. "I saw you push her," she shouted. "You grabbed her wrist. You yanked the spindle, then shoved her." Pamela froze, not at the accusation, but at the crowd gathering, at the whispers, the phones being raised. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but it felt like years. I rode beside Grandma in the back, gripping the stretcher's edge as the sirens wailed through Wellington Glen. Machines beeped. Monitors flickered. The paramedics worked fast. Vital signs, pupil checks, stabilizers. Miraculously, she was alive. Bruised ribs, a broken wrist, a mild concussion, but nothing life-threatening. She felt just like I was taught, she whispered to me when the chaos settled. Tuck and roll, judicial self-defense, comes in handy. Her humor was intact, but her eyes had sharpened, and then she squeezed my hand and said only 4 words, "Get the red folder." That's when I knew. Pamela's war was over. She just didn't know it yet. I left the hospital without a word, drove home with shaking hands, and went straight to the study. There it was, tucked into the second drawer on the left, exactly where she said it would be, the red leather folder, heavy with the weight of evidence. Legal precision in paper form. Inside were documents meticulously arranged in sections, each tabbed and labeled in Grandma's elegant handwriting. Property deeds, surveillance stills, signed witness statements, HOA meeting transcripts, email printouts, and tucked in the back, like the final piece of a puzzle, a slim USB drive. I plugged it into her laptop. The security footage loaded instantly, and what I saw, I couldn't breathe. Clear as day, multiple camera angles showed Pamela and her husband, Bob, on our balcony the night before the incident. They weren't just snooping. They were tampering, loosening screws, testing railings, whispering as they moved with surgical precision. They tested several spindles, chose the weakest one, gently bent it to test its resistance, smiled. That alone would have been enough. But there was more. A second video, captured from a discreet corner camera Grandma had installed above the back porch, showed the exact moment of confrontation the next morning. Pamela demanding Grandma sign paperwork authorizing immediate demolition of her non-compliant fence. Grandma refusing. Pamela stepping forward, her hands tightening on the spindle, her voice low, then the push. The footage captured everything. The movement, the angle, the hesitation, and the violence. There was no ambiguity. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't an accident. This was an attempted takedown, calculated and caught on tape. I called Detective Mason, my grandmother's former clerk, and now a veteran investigator for the county. He arrived within the hour. I watched his face as he reviewed the footage. First in silence, then with a slow shake of his head. "Classic Eleanor," he murmured. "Always 3 steps ahead." Pamela was still in the hospital waiting room when he approached her, tablet in hand, evidence cued and ready. She didn't even see him coming. I would later learn she was texting her HOA board members at that very moment, instructing them to move on the fence now that the old lady is down. But before she could hit send, Mason cleared his throat. "Pamela Greaves," he said, his voice firm and calm. "You are under arrest for assault, battery, attempted murder, and criminal property tampering." Her designer purse slipped from her shoulder as the blood drained from her face. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "Do you even know who I am?" "My husband plays golf with Judge Avery." Detective Mason didn't blink. "And do you know who Eleanor Grayson is?" he asked softly. "The woman you just tried to kill?" Pamela hesitated. Mason leaned in. "She wrote the precedent-setting opinion on HOA governance in this state. The same opinion you just violated. She mentored half the judges on the circuit, including Judge Avery. He held up the warrant, signed just hours earlier, and that's why he signed this." Pamela said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. 3 weeks later, I wheeled my grandmother into the courthouse. Though still sore, bruised, and walking with a cane she may never part with, Justice Eleanor Grayson sat tall, composed, and unshakable. The moment she entered the courtroom, silence rippled like a sudden change in weather. Attorneys, clerks, even the bailiff stood instinctively, not out of pity but respect. Everyone knew who she was. Pamela didn't look quite so confident anymore. Her designer wardrobe had been replaced by a dull gray pantsuit. Her hair, once meticulously styled, now hung with roots showing and ends brittle from weeks in custody. She sat at the defendant's table, a shell of the woman who once strutted across Wellington Glen, with a clipboard like a scepter. And then came the final blow. Judge Avery, whose name Pamela had dropped so arrogantly during her arrest, stood and recused himself. "This case will be heard by Judge Helena Martinez of Redwood County," he announced. Given my personal and professional relationship with Justice Grayson, I wish to avoid even the appearance of bias. Pamela's face went pale, because Judge Martinez wasn't just another name on a docket. She was a former law clerk of my grandmother's, a protege, one of the many legal minds Justice Grayson had shaped over 3 decades on the bench. During recess, Pamela's attorney approached us. His offer was simple: plead guilty to lesser charges, receive time served, and walk free in exchange of my grandmother dropping her civil suit. Grandma didn't even blink. "Counselor," she said gently, her voice carrying the same velvet steel that once made senators sweat, "your client didn't just assault me. She assaulted the rule of law. She weaponized policy against the vulnerable. She used fear to extract property from the elderly. That isn't just criminal, it's corrupt. There will be no deals today." Pamela's attorney looked away. He already knew this wasn't about revenge. This was about accountability. The trial lasted only 6 days. The prosecution laid out every piece: the video footage, the red folders documentation, the HOA's missing funds, the falsified architectural committee, and the paper trail connecting the fraudulent fines to a development company owned by Pamela's brother. Witness after witness came forward. 12 elderly homeowners, each with stories that mirror my grandmother's. Photos of vandalism, threatening notes, surveillance footage, bank records. Even the building inspectors testified they'd been pressured to invent violations. Some were offered money. Others were threatened. Pamela never testified. Her silence didn't save her. Because when Judge Martinez delivered the sentence, 8 years for assault, fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse, she used Eleanor Grayson's own words in her closing remarks: "Power, when exercised without accountability, corrupts not just the wielder, but the system it claims to serve." Pamela's shoulders sank, and for the first time, she looked small. The very community she tried to exploit was now watching her be led away in handcuffs. And justice, slow and methodical as it may be, had finally come full circle. In the weeks that followed the sentencing, Wellington Glen began to bloom again, not just in flowers, but in spirit. Pamela's grip had once been suffocating, a neighborhood held hostage by bylaws and fear. But now, something else had taken root. Hope, Mrs. Morales, the neighbor who had shouted the truth that day from her porch, organized a meal train during my grandmother's recovery. Families who once kept their heads down brought soup, fresh bread, and handmade cards for Judge Grayson, the Rose Lady. The local Woodworkers Guild, some of whom had seen Pamela's abuse firsthand, volunteered to rebuild and reinforce the balcony. They matched the style of the original cedar fence, even carving subtle roses into the support beams, an homage to Grandma's garden and her resilience. The HOA, now restructured with interim leadership and under court-appointed oversight, was stripped of its power to issue unilateral fines or override city permits. One of the new board members, a former teacher, stood before the community and said, "From now on, this association serves people, not property values." The change was visible. The fear was gone. And every evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hedges, you could find my grandmother sitting beside a restored fence, roses in bloom, clipboard in hand, reviewing housing ordinances not for battle, but to help. Neighbors began stopping by not with complaints, but with questions. "Can I install a wheelchair ramp for my mother? Do you think my yard modifications fall under the historic preservation clause? Would you mind reviewing this permit?" And she welcomed them all. Her living room, once a quiet retreat for tea and casebooks, became an informal legal clinic. Neighbors seated on her couch, listening as she guided them through rights they never knew they had. She never charged a dime, because for Justice Eleanor Grayson, the fight had never been about retribution. It had been about clarity, about sunlight in the shadows. And the most poetic part? The very property Pamela once lived in, bought with embezzled funds and HOA manipulation, was seized by the court. Today, it's a community garden, named for my grandmother. Children learn to grow herbs and tomatoes where Pamela once plotted over hedge heights and porch paint. On sunny afternoons, my grandmother wheels herself over, roses in one hand, legal pad in the other, ready to help anyone who needs to be heard. Sometimes I sit on the bench beside her. She doesn't say much, just smiles at the garden and at the people who finally have their neighborhood back. 6 months after the sentencing, a letter arrived, handwritten, no return address, just my grandmother's name in block print. Inside, folded carefully between the creases, was 3 pages of blue-lined paper. The handwriting was neat but shaky, controlled but not confident. At the top, 1 line in all caps. From Pamela Greaves. For a long moment, Grandma just stared at it. Then, with quiet resolve, she opened it and began to read aloud. I never realized what I was doing until it was too late. It began. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood, protecting values. But I see now, I wasn't enforcing anything. I was controlling people, pushing them, punishing them. And for what? She paused and looked at me, eyes still sharp behind the softness of age. She's not asking for forgiveness, she said, turning the page. And she wasn't. Pamela described growing up around wealth, learning early that rules weren't meant to serve. They were meant to sort, meant to protect the people at the top. She admitted she saw Grandma's fence not as a threat to the neighborhood, but to her control over it. You stood for something I could never touch, Pamela wrote. You didn't yell. You didn't fight dirty. You just stood still, and I hated how that made me feel. But the final paragraph was what hit hardest. I used bylaws as weapons. I punished people for painting their doors the wrong shade of green. I made old women cry over garden gnomes. And I justified it all in the name of community order. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of being seen for what I really was. And then, in shaky ink, her closing words. I never understood justice until it stood in front of me and didn't flinch. Grandma folded the letter gently, placed it in her drawer, and said nothing for a long time. Finally, she looked out the window at the community garden across the street. I hope she finds peace, she said quietly. Not because she deserves it, but because she finally saw what she broke. And that was that. No bitterness. No pride. Just closure. There's a photograph that sits on my grandmother's nightstand. It's not of her swearing at a federal judge, or speaking before the Supreme Court, or receiving one of the dozens of legal honors that marked her career. No, it's something simpler. It's her, seated in the Wellington Glen Community Garden, wearing her favorite sun hat, surrounded by children planting basil and marigolds. Her cane rests at her side. Her hands are in the dirt, and her face is calm. That garden now grows where Pamela Greaves' house once stood, a symbol of what happens when power is used to heal, not control, when a neighborhood stops living in fear and starts growing towards something better. My grandmother still gets visitors, former clerks, local attorneys, young neighbors seeking guidance. Some come for advice on HOA law, others just to talk. And no matter how busy the day, she always makes time. Because her fight was never just about offense. It was about reminding people that justice is not loud, not flashy, and not cruel. It's steady, rooted, patient, like her roses. The cedar fence that started it all, it still stands, restored, sealed, and now designated a historic landmark, protected by law, but more importantly, protected by community. And every evening, as the sun sets and the breeze moves gently through the blooms, Grandma sits beside it, pruning with a small smile, often saying the same thing to anyone who passes. The law, like nature, always finds its balance in the end. She never raised her voice. She never needed to, because Eleanor Grayson didn't just live by the law. She became its legacy.